Hello, everyone. I assume there are people here listening. What I'm going to present on today is a presentation on situational awareness. Um, and this was a study that we did back in 2004 for OSD Net Assessment, Andy Marshall's shop. So Andy Marshall, for those not familiar with it, he had the nickname of Yoda, and he had been there running OSD's net assessment since 1973. He had been a political appointee and was reappointed by all administrations, Democratic or Republican, reappointed every 4 years. And he had been there for over 40 years, and then retired in 2015. OSD Net Assessment was kind of the center for the revolution of military affairs. And this survey, which is an actual quantitative analysis of the actual advantages of situational awareness based upon real world data, this survey does not really support the revolution of military affairs. But it was the only effort I'm aware of to actually measure the combat advantage of situational awareness based upon real world data, in this case, historical data, but nonetheless, real world combat data. While no one else seems to be talking about RMA now, especially thanks to the war in Ukraine, there are certainly valid reasons to discuss evolutions in military affairs, and clearly things are changing over time. So this serves as a baseline, shall we say, and the only quantitative baseline that I know of on the subject. Now, this presentation originally came out of a multi-hour presentation I gave for the Marine Corps Information Operations Command back in 2016. And I just finished up my book, War by Numbers. And having just finished up my book, War by Numbers, I literally clipped the presentation out of the book. Now, it will look that way at times, because at times I'm going to end up going into detail and text that you'd normally not do in a presentation. But if you need to see the details, they are in the book. I have 2 full chapters in my book, War by Numbers, that covers what's in this presentation. War by Numbers is basically a book that assembled a lot of the work we had done on conventional warfare over time. And as you can see by the chapter listing here, it covers a lot of different subjects: human factors, lower level combat, dispersion in combat, advanced race casualties, urban warfare, combat model validation, etc. But buried in there is 2 chapters: one, the combat value of superior situational awareness, and the combat value of surprise. So the original presentation consisted of 2 parts: a combat value of superior situational awareness and a combat value of surprise. And then for the sake of our customers' interest, we also applied a little discussion on as applied to operations security, as applied to tactical deception, and as applied to psychological operations. And I've kept that in this briefing, although if we go over, we may skip some of that. So, this is the only known study that I know of that measures the real-world advantages of situational awareness based upon real-world data. Now, situational awareness has existed since ancient times, when generals were able to stand on a hill and overlook the battlefield. In many cases, with the small forces arrayed before them, they had complete situational awareness. They could see everyone out there. Now, what I've never seen is somebody who has taken that material and analyzed that material from the beginning of military history, which is roughly about 1200 BC to the present, looking at what happens if you have complete situational awareness. And of course, theoretically, what was going to kick in the RMA was the fact that you would have complete situational awareness. Now, this was something that did exist at points in time far in the past. Over time, it disappeared. And what changed over time was the size and dispersion of the forces that a general deployed. And we eventually ended up with large armies and continuous fronts that created sort of the modern fog of war problem. This certainly happened in World War I with continuous fronts. Everyone dug in, everyone obscured, lots of, et cetera. And no clear vantage point that people could see everyone, and then even the tradition of people wearing brightly colored uniforms so you could tell which forces were which disappeared, etc. So over time, we have lost that concept of complete situational awareness. So so the RMA was pretty much an attempt to restore that bird's eye view to the battlefield. So what we ended up doing was trying to do side-by-side comparisons from historical data of cases where there was less situational awareness compared to cases where there was more. This was very similar to several studies that we did, in particular our urban warfare study, where we simply compared military operations in the areas outside of a city to the military operations of the areas inside the city, and then looked at what the difference was. It's kind of the closest thing you can get to experimental data. This was based upon an extensive data collection. We've been collecting data for a long time, which is a long subject. But we had 295 division level engagements from World War II to work from. 149 division level engagements from the Western Front, 146 division level engagements from the Eastern Front. With 12 exceptions, all these engagements were assembled before we ever got this contract to do this study. So this was all material we had assembled over time, long before we got to this study. This being one of our last of later conventional warfare studies, we've done a series of studies on enemy prisoner war capture rates, urban warfare, medium weight armor, etc. This benefited that our databases have been developed over time due to the previous studies, and so this was kind of the final version of the database. Then we ended up going through all those 295 engagements as to their knowledge of the enemy. What was the level of situational awareness? And we ended up with 5 coded cases: complete, considerable, some, little, and none. Now, the actual definitions of what was used for each of these categories is in my book, War by Numbers. I didn't bother to put in the slide. Definitions get tiresome quickly. But anyhow, we did have actual definitions, and we did code each of the engagements to these 5 categories. Now, in all reality, there wasn't very many cases of complete situational awareness in World War II data, and there was very few cases of none. The nature of combat units fighting side by side in formations, etc., they always know a little bit about who's in front of them. We then coded it based upon examination of intelligence reports from both sides. So me and another analyst, Richard Anderson, went through the intel reports, the G2 reports for each of the units, and went back through and evaluated what they saw and what they understood of the enemy's appearance. So there was a little bit of analyst judgment there, but not much. It was pretty clear almost all the way through. And of course, with 295 cases, an analyst judgment error here or there was not going to change the results. So theoretically, if you got 5 cases coded for the attacker and you got 5 cases coded for the defender, you end up with a matrix of 25. But in all practical purposes, everyone was pretty much coded considerable, some, and little, so you end up with a 3x3 matrix. And for some reason, this chart didn't quite come out right, but you can see we had 81 cases where the attacker had considerable knowledge of the defender and the defender had considerable knowledge of the attacker. That was 81 out of the 295 cases. And you can see we get very few cases where the attacker has little knowledge of the defender and the defender has considerable knowledge of the attacker. We only had 4 of those cases. So you can see the actual concentration varies depending on the situation. And fact of the matter is the norm appears to be considerable to some knowledge of the enemy. Now, this is, the database we're using is 149 engagements from the European theater, European theater operations, a lot of from the Italian campaign of 43, first half of 44, a lot of from the Ardennes. They're all listed in my book, so you can go look at them. All the ones in that I use for the Eastern Front are all from the Battle of Kursk or the 3 battles of Kharkov. And we had assembled engagements for the Battle of Kharkov in February, March, and August of 43 as a result of our urban warfare studies. So, they are snapshots of various parts of the battlefield, but in many cases, In the case of Kursk, for example, there every single unit that was attacking or defending in Kursk, and we systematically coded all 100 and something engagements across the battlefield, 200 engagements across the battlefield for the Battle of Kursk. And then there was two ways to look at it. Should we look at whether somebody had considerable some or little knowledge of the enemy, or whether the attacker had much more knowledge than the defender, or the defender had much more knowledge of the attacker? We weren't sure which was the better approach to use, so we did both, which of course makes things more complex, but still we shot them both. And there was 32 cases out of our 295 where surprise was achieved. Now, surprise was a judgment call made by the analyst and was coded into these engagements long before we ever did this study. This database was first started being developed in the 1980s, was heavily improved in the 1990s and the early 2000s by us. But as we did each engagement, if we felt that one side got surprised, we recorded an engagement and then recorded the level of surprise. This was all done independent of this study. The only thing we did in this study was we coded the knowledge of the enemy. So you can see where the attacker was much more knowledgeable, they got surprised in 5 out of 22 cases. Where they know a whole lot more about the defender than the defender knows about them, they got surprised 1 out of 5 times. As we'll show later on in the briefing, surprise is a big force multiplier. It gives you a 25 to 50% combat advantage. Doesn't necessarily double your combat advantage, but it is a force multiplier no matter what. When the knowledge of both sides was the same, you end up with surprise about 10% of the time. And then when the defender became more knowledgeable than the attacker, or the defender was much more knowledgeable than the attacker, surprise almost never occurred. And then we tried to get sophisticated and in depth in our analysis, and we tried to compare information advantage based upon mission accomplishment, casualty effectiveness, and special effectiveness. And we ended up using 2 ways to measure mission accomplishment. So we buried down into this. This was a long, couple 100-page analytical report. And then we also separated the Western Front from the Eastern Front. And then on the Eastern Front, we separated from when the Germans were attacking as the Soviets were attacking, because of human factors differences, there was a performance difference between German and Soviet attacks. So we buried down into this, and a lot of the slides are going to show this. Don't hang up too much on them. Some tentative conclusions. There is some effect of an information advantage on mission accomplishment. The percent of attacker wins less drawn engagements declines from 80% when the attacker is much more knowledgeable down to 50% when the defender is more knowledgeable. Now, I think this is significant. What was going on in the heydays of the RMA back in 2004 was people were trying to make their arguments based upon thimbles and P's under thimbles, and you would guess where the P was and how, et cetera. And so therefore, if you had information advantage that allowed you to, et cetera, and they would do all these sort of intellectual constructs that were not real world. This is a real world measurement. It's nowhere near as significant as some of the intellectual constructs out there that they're using to argue in favor of the RMA. But I think it's significant. It's just not as significant as they expected. And the feedback, we never got any formal feedback. The informal feedback was that they sort of felt that this report didn't quite show what they wanted it to show. I would argue that it shows what it shows. It shows what the data shows. And as far as I can tell, this is closer to reality than anything else that anyone else was doing. Second point, there is no cases of the attacker wins when the defender has much greater knowledge. Now, this is only 4 cases, so, we need to research further. And even though you have 295 cases, when you get to the extremes, you have very few cases. So, at some point, the answer is you always need more data. And that's actually always a valid question. There's a tendency to believe that you need to work the data better. I just say you need more data and you don't have to manipulate or work the data as a result. An information advantage does not directly lead to a more favorable casualty exchange ratio. And spatial effectiveness advance rates appear to be correlated with the percent of attacker wins, not necessarily the information advantage. So what did we have? We had 124 cases where the attacker had considerable knowledge. We had 54 cases where the attacker had little knowledge. We had 109 cases where the defender had considerable knowledge. We had 86 cases where the defender had little knowledge. So we then conducted our analysis based upon this. We ended up with the following conclusions. This first one's pretty significant. In the case of measuring mission accomplishment, we are left to conclude that only the defender's knowledge of the attacker's situation is critical to the results of the battle. Now, that's an interesting finding, because what it basically says is that situational awareness is more important for the defender than it is for the attacker. It makes a big difference for the defender than it does for the attacker. Now, these are all World War II division level engagements. In most cases, they have a unit on their right, they have a unit on their left, they're going against the unit, there's a unit in front of them, there's a unit up to that right, there's a unit to that left. So the attacker is going to kind of go where the attacker is going to go no matter what. They've set up the battle plans, etc. So, their knowledge of what's in front of them does not change what they're going to do. It is the defender's knowledge of the attacker that makes all the difference as to how the defender will defend, where they will defend, and what they will, and whether they need reinforcements or not. It does not appear that looking at the data by a different measurement has really changed the outcomes. And we do not see any effect on special effectiveness that does not directly result in winning or losing. Now, the reason I keep focusing on these sub-factors is that there's been various attempts at various times to correlate force ratios to advance rates and stuff like that, which of course never actually works, but people still try to do it. And so I was always looking for that. And then we get into the issue of surprise. And again, my tables ain't matching up for some reason, possibly because I did this graph on one computer and I just moved it to another, these charts. So we got, we got 20 cases of minor surprise. We have 12 cases of what we coded as considerable surprise, and we have no cases that we coded in these 295 engagements of what we called complete surprise. So out of the 295 cases, 90% of the cases the attacker has no surprise. 6% and 10% of the cases the attacker achieves surprise. For the defenders, 99% of the time they achieve no surprise. And 1% of the time they achieve minor surprise. Now, this is what happens when you use real world data that is not cherry picked. So we did, every battle around Salerno. We did every battle in Ardennes. We did every single engagement, including cases where units were sitting opposite each other doing nothing during the Battle of Kursk. So we systematically coded engagements across all environments and all situations. And as a result, the norm is 90% of the time, nobody gets surprised. Now, if you read history, or if you follow, or you get your knowledge of military history from watching movies, that would not be the impression you get. But fact of the matter is that when you start looking at norms and databases and large databases, then you end up with 90% of the time for the attacker and 99% of the time for the defender, nobody gets surprised. Okay. I see Chris Weave's question, and I'll stop here for a moment and ask and go through his question. I wonder how this might change with new elements in warfare, e.g., with the advent of deep strike changes the utility of situational awareness to the attacker. It might. The problem is I don't have any data. You would have to be able to assemble something comparable. You would have to find data where you would have to find cases where you can get access to the unit records of both sides. Since World War II, it is hard to find any war where you can get access to the unit records of both sides. So how do you measure it? How do you evaluate their knowledge of each other? How do you evaluate the advantage changed? Now, you may be able to do something by collecting one-sided data from the Ukrainian side, if you can get access to it, and if they'll let you have access to it and systematically collect it, which right now I don't know if they will. But you might reach the point where you can do that, and then you might be able to do something based upon one-sided data. But quite honestly, that's beyond the reach of any individual to do anything significant with. I mean, I did this with 295 engagements because we had a database we had been building since the 1980s. We had a database that's probably has a market that probably has a reconstruct value of $1 or $2 million. We had put man years of effort into rebuilding that data. So if you're going to end up going through here, other than doing observational data, you know, one guy can go out to the battlefield, talk to a half a dozen people, get impressions. One guy can go out to the battlefield, observe a few things, and write down notes. But if you're going to go beyond observational data and actually do real analysis, and observation is not the same as analysis. If you're going to actually do real analysis, then you're going to end up having to put together a team, place them over there, and systematically connect data, which means you're going to have to get budget, and I have no idea who's going to budget that. You know, in this case, I got funded by Andy Marshall for several $100,000, and I had an existing database I could build this off of, and I had staff working for me. So, now we have multiple databases. So we were getting surprise occurring 10% of the time for the attackers out of our 295 cases. We had other different databases you can look at and different fronts. So we have a battalion level database. In those cases, surprise occurs 30% of the time. Defender surprise occurs 1% of the time. We have a database of 243 battles from 1600 to 1800, and surprise for the attacker occurs 25% of the time and 5% of the time for the defender, and et cetera. And if we add up all the 1,471 cases from all of our databases, where surprise was a factor in 17% of those cases. So surprise does happen. It is a combat multiplier. It happens. I will stick with our 295 cases because it's less cherry picked than the rest. It happens about 10% of the time for the attacker and about 1% of the time for the defender. Now, you know, when I say 1% of the time, most of these engagements were a single division fighting for a single day. And this kind of repeats what I already said, so we'll just skip to that surprise. And then we sat there and we looked at levels of knowledge of each other versus the number of cases of surprise, and there's no surprises there. I mean, quite simply, if the defender knows if one side knows a whole lot more about the other side, they're more likely to get surprise, and the data supported that. It's always nice when the data supports what you assume it should support. And then we looked at it as measure of information advantage, and again, we showed up that the attacker never got surprised when the defender was more knowledgeable to the attacker. So to summarize, attacker. In 23% of the cases where the attacker had more knowledge than the defender, the attacker achieved surprise. In 15% of the cases where the attacker had more knowledge than the defender, the attacker achieved surprise. So when 23% of the cases where the attacker had much more knowledge than the defender, the attacker achieved surprise. That's when the attacker had considerable knowledge of the defender and the defender had little knowledge of the attacker. In the 15 cases where the attacker had more knowledge than the defender, the attacker achieved surprise. 9% of the cases where both sides had similar levels of knowledge, the attacker achieved surprise. In no cases did the attacker achieve surprise where the defender was more knowledgeable. And again, this reinforces the earlier point that information advantage is more critical to the defender. And we're gonna skip this slide, and we're gonna skip this slide. It's all kind of reinforcing in the same thing. Now, Trevor Dupuy, in his writings, and his ended up coming up with a set of rules and values for surprise, which I repeat them here, and they're repeated in my book, War by Numbers. This is the only case I know of somebody who tried to come up with a value of surprise. And he needed it as a set of rules for his combat model, so he came up with a set of rules, a set of factors, etc. We did not necessarily see anything that confirmed these rules, but we didn't see anything that disagreed with them. So, but we tried to measure the value of surprise using our cases. And the value of surprise we measured was in 3 different ways. First, we examined mission accomplishment, that is, who achieved a higher percent of wins or better wins for those engagements without surprise. Second, we compared to those with. Second, we examined casualty effectiveness, meaning who caused more casualties. And third, we examined spatial effectiveness, meaning how much ground did they advance and take. It appears that the benefit of surprise is that it increases the chance of success by more than 50%, and increases the scoring of success by at least 50%. Scoring meaning that where we scored the engagement based upon the outcome and said one engagement has a value of 7, another engagement has a value of 5 because they achieve more of their objectives. So it does appear to surprise increases the outcome of the engagement about 50%, meaning you're going to do about, you're going to win 3 times instead of 2 times if you have surprise. We didn't see much beyond that, because the real thing that drives casualties and that drives advance rates is the outcome of the engagement. And so if you increase the outcome, if you increase the results of the outcome of the engagement, you're going to get better other results. But though we could not independently see that there was better other results outside of the outcome of the engagement. To summarize the relationship between situation awareness and surprise, any information advantage leads to doubling the chance of surprise. And information advantage leads to doubling the chance of surprise. Poor enemy situation awareness leads to a 20% chance of surprise. Surprise increases the chance of a favorable outcome by at least 50%. Surprise doubles the opposed advance rate, in part due to increased favorable outcomes. One could therefore conclude that poor enemy situational awareness and, a lesser extent, information advantage on the surprise leads to at least a 50% chance of a favorable outcome. Therefore, the real value of poor enemy situational awareness as a force multiplier is somewhere around 10% or greater, up to a maximum of 20%. This is without its value outside of the consideration of surprise. This is just looking at the issue of surprise. On the other hand, in the defense, an information advantage secures one against surprise, preventing the enemy attacker from gaining an advantage over the defender due to poor situational awareness. So, Mr. Parker, no, I have not, did not specifically look at that. Oddly enough, when you're sitting there crunching through 295 cases and systematically going through an analysis, all these sort of little side issues are saved for later, and later never occurred. We did not get we did not get follow-on funding to do a second phase of the study and a third phase of the study, and I have my biases because this is what I do for a living, but often you need to take a study to a second and third phase, because once you've completed it, you've learned this much, but you need to go a little further to learn a little bit more, et cetera, which means that once you've assembled the team and done the study, then you need to get your sponsors to fund you for the second phase or the third phase. Now, sponsors seem to have a hostility towards doing that. They kind of like the one and done attitude. And so we've done many studies that were a good start, and particularly on issues like breakpoints, we've done many studies that were a good start and then never got the funding or the support to do further analysis of it. So we ended up doing 4 tests of the data. First was to determine if an information advantage resulted in an advantage in combat other than from surprise, which it does. Second was to determine if situational awareness resulted in advantage in combat other than from surprise. It did. Third was to see if information advantage or situational awareness increases the chance of surprise, and it does. Fourth was to obtain a measurement of the combat value of that surprise, which we kind of sort of did. So to briefly summarize our results, In the engagements we examined, both sides that had the same level of situational awareness. Oh, is this the long multi-point? Yeah. Okay, now we're going to go through 22 points. That were the conclusion of the study. And I lumped them together based upon subject matter. So first, 4 points relate to the nature of the data. In the engagements we examined, both sides had the same level of situational awareness over 60% of the time. They tend to know kind of what each other know about each other. In addition to many units having similar levels of situational awareness, the attacker and defender had a similar number of cases where they held the information advantage. Having significant information advantage was not common, less than 10% of the cases. The nature of their operations really does influence the degree of situational awareness. And of course, we're looking at division level engagements on continuous fronts. You know, if you looked at Napoleonic battlefields, you'd get a slightly different scenario. The value of information advantage. We got 3 points related to that. There's probably 3 items that should draw attention in the data on mission effectiveness. First is in the percentage of attacker wins, less draws. In this case, it declines from 80% chance of win when the attacker is much more knowledgeable, meaning they have considerable and the defender has little knowledge of them, down to 50% chance when the defender is more knowledgeable. One notes that the scoring, not surprisingly, follows the same pattern. So we measured it 2 ways. We measured it percent wins and the scoring scale 1 through 10 that the analysts had done evaluating how each side performed. So we had 2 methods of determining outcomes. We tested them both on mission effectiveness, found that they both were fairly similar. Another significant point is that there is no attacker wins when the defender has much more knowledge. Point 6, it would appear that information advantage does not lead to a more favorable casualty exchange ratio. Point 7, we are seeing no effect on spatial effectiveness as not directly related, as it is not directly a result of the issue of winning or losing. Now, all this stuff was cut and pasted out of my book, War by Numbers, so you can go through and hit all these points by going through the book. Or you can go and get the original report also, which oddly enough, very few people have actually uploaded from us. Mr. Parker, back in 2004 when I did this, I could have probably answered that question off the top of my head. It's been 20 years. It'll take me a while to find it. Popping knowledge off the top of your head of each engagement gets a little tough 20 years later. But it's all, you know, they're all listed in the report that we submitted to the government. So there is a report that we submitted to Andy Marshall, value of situational awareness, and we list in the appendixes all the engagements and all the data related to the engagements, and that is in the appendix in that report. So the value of situational awareness. Point 8, in the case of measuring mission accomplishment, we are left to conclude that only the defender's knowledge of the attacker's situation is critical to the results of the battle. It does not appear that any conclusion about casualty effectiveness can be reached from this data. We again see no effect on spatial effectiveness that is not directly related to the issue of winning or losing. Point 11, the effects of situational awareness on force ratios. Now, my table got a little skewed here, but you can see there's the force ratios of all engagements, considerable, some, and little, and everyone's attacking at about 2 to 1, a little bit less than 2 to 1 on average, because nobody listens to a 3 to 1 rule because there's no validity to it. But you can see where the people have little knowledge of the enemy, they tend to attack at lower force ratios. And that shows up consistently across the data, with a few exceptions. This is still not a very definitive result, but still, it's an interesting trend. Point 12, there is not much evidence to support the notion that the defender having good situational awareness moves in their favor the force ratios for division level combat. That's not particularly surprising when you think it all the way through. But yeah, it's the attacker not knowing much about the defender sometimes leads to low odds attacks. No big surprise. And Hate to say this, force ratios do matter in combat. Chance of surprise. We have already pretty much covered this, but we're hitting the summary points. 13, surprise is not common, occurring in about 10% of the cases we examined by the attacker and 1% of the cases we examined by the defender. 14, having an information advantage increases the chance of surprise. At 23% of the cases where the attacker had much more knowledge than the defender, the attacker achieved surprise. In 15% of the cases where the attacker had more knowledge, not much more knowledge than the defender, the attacker achieved surprise. In 9% of the cases where both sides had similar levels of knowledge, the attacker achieved surprise. In no cases where the attacker achieved surprise where the defender was more knowledgeable. One is left with the impression that it is the defender's knowledge of the attacker or lack thereof that creates the possibility of surprise, not the attacker's knowledge of the defender. Points 16 through 21. We're almost to the end of the points, and then I got additional slides, but we'll take a break and take some questions after that. Value of surprise. 16. It appears that the benefit of surprise is that it increases the chance of success by more than 50%, up to 72% based on the scoring of wins, and increases the scoring of success by at least 50%, up to 61% based upon whatever the difference of measurements I'm using there. 17. While surprise does increase the chance of successful outcome, it does not necessarily create a more favorable casualty exchange ratio. 18. One does not achieve better spatial effectiveness with surprise. 19, to summarize the relationship between situational awareness and surprise, and we've already gone over these numbers, so we'll skip that. 20, one could therefore conclude that poor enemy situational awareness and a lesser extent and information advantage results in a 20% chance of surprise, and surprise leads to a 50% chance of a more favorable outcome. Now you could stick that into a combat results table if you're designing a war game. That statement right there. 21. On the other hand, in the defense, an information advantage secures one against surprise, preventing the enemy from gaining an advantage over the defender due to poor enemy situational awareness. 22. This is my bias, but I keep trying to make this point. Our conclusion is not that data needs more analysis, but that we indeed need more data. So I base this upon 295 points. In the case of looking at the two sides, that meant I ended up with 590 data points when I looked at both the attacker and defender. I still ended up with areas where there was little cases. I ended up with almost no cases of no situational awareness. I ended up with almost no cases of complete situational awareness. I still ended up with tails on my database that I needed to explore further. I didn't have enough data. I had 4 cases of where the defender had considerable knowledge of the attacker and the attacker had little knowledge of the defender. And that was out of 295 in division level engagements. It's quite clear that I need to expand this analysis and reshoot it with 600 cases. That's doable. It just takes people and time. So let me, I'm going to skip these 2 slides for a moment. Let me take a few questions before I go into final observations. And if anyone's got a question they want to post up, or if they want to ask, please do so now, and then, or otherwise I'll just continue going through the rest of the slides. Okay, let me continue moving forward. Final observations. This is kind of when we start reaching a little bit beyond our data. Obscuration. I'm mispronouncing it. Obscuration, poor enemy situational awareness is as important for the attacker as having good situational awareness. Being able to obscure what you're doing and who you are is as important as your knowledge of the enemy. This comparison, which was never the intent of this study, came about because of the pattern seen in the data. It's quite clear that as the attacker, you're probably as concerned with obscuring your forces as you are with finding out what the defender is doing. because in the end, it's the defender's knowledge of you that makes the difference. The same may also be true for the defender. Certainly, the defender is seriously disadvantaged by having little situational awareness. Having good situational awareness or an information advantage is important for the defender and may be more important than for the attacker. It may be more important for the defender to know what the attacker is doing than for the attacker to know what the defender is doing. Again, if you have finite resources, then if you're going to provide good intel data and good knowledge and situational awareness to your forces, you probably want to make sure that the people who are holding territory are the people who are better informed. If you have to prioritize between them and trade off between them. The value of good situational awareness as a force multiplier is about 50% or greater. These are tentative results. Point 4. Even though the study was done using far more real-world data than anyone else has attempted to use, more still needs to be done. This is the first study that we are aware of that has attempted to measure the combat value of situational awareness using real-world combat data, and we did this study in 2004, and in 2024, 20 years later, as far as I know, this is still the only study that has been done using real-world combat data to examine situational awareness. Now, I have briefed this over in Norway. I have briefed it at I have briefed it at my conference. This was my annual historical analysis conference. I'm giving the briefing at my conference this October. So I have been talking to other people who have been out here doing this stuff, and nobody is aware of anyone else who's done a similar study. I'm not aware of it, and I have not run across anyone else who knows of anything else. Maybe there's something buried there that's classified confidential I have not seen, but I have not seen anything further, and that's after 20 years. So we did the first one, and as far as I know, we've done the only such study. There is definitely a need for analysis of situational awareness in operations below division level, and all of our work was at division level. In effect, this current study can be viewed as an analysis of the advantage of improved situational awareness in the corps, divisions, and brigade headquarters. A similar analysis should be done using battalion level data to see if there's a difference in results at that level. Now, the problem with the battalion level data is getting hold of it, especially getting hold of it for both sides. Our division level database is 752 cases. Our battalion level database is 127 cases. It's a lot easier to collect division level data because you can actually pull up the unit records from the archives of both sides, read what they're doing, read what they know about the enemy, read the results, look at what their casualties are, etc. Trying to find that for two opposing battalions is a challenge. Next point. While there have been historical analysis and studies based on a few examples of information advantages, basically case studies, there is no other broad-ranging study similar to ours. What we have seen in our casual readings are measurements of situational awareness that are based upon abstract games. While this may be fine as an intellectual construct, it does not, by any stretch of the imagination, a measurement of the advantage of situational awareness in the real world. We suspect that some studies may have also been done using data from war games and exercises. But again, this is not data derived from real combat. It is fundamentally different from what we are analyzing. That's a pretty strong condemning statement. It's in our original study. It's in my book, War by Numbers. A lot of the stuff that I was seeing being done out there back in 2004, at the time I wrote the report, a lot of the stuff I felt was pretty lightweight. Quite simply, if you're not collecting real data from real combat, you're not studying war. If you're not collecting real data from real combat, instead of using something like a war game or or an exercise, you're not really studying the subject. And then let me go for my last couple of slides here. And this was specifically in response to our customer, because when I put this briefing originally together in 2016, it was part of a course I was giving for the Marine Information Operations Command. And they were particularly interested in issues like operations security. So I did a few slides to highlight their interest. As applied to operations security, in the percentage of attacker wins, less draws, it declines from 80% chance of win when the attacker is more knowledgeable down to 50% chance when the defender is more knowledgeable. How can these numbers be affected by operations security? Well, obviously, you can see where it can. In the case of measuring mission accomplishment, we are left to conclude that only the defender's knowledge of the attacker's situation is critical to the results of the battle. The goal appears to make the defender less knowledgeable as possible. The attacker does not seem to be affected to the same degree. Is there another way of looking at it? And of course, this was a course and a class, so people commented and discussed it, etc. As applied to tactical deception, showing the false, which is always a big discussion that people have. Showing the false does not appear on the tactical level. So, there was over over 190 daily engagements during the Battle of Kursk when we put together the Kursk database. I ended up going through the unit records, the daily records of each side, every single German division, which are 17 German divisions and 47 Soviet divisions and corps, etc. And how many times did I see showing the false in all those records? None. For example, at Kursk, the two flanking corps launched feints on 5 July 1943. These were quickly recognized as such by the opposing side. Similar with the flanking units at Ardennes. We also looked at the Battle of Ardennes. Their impact appears minor. These kind of efforts are done all the time, meaning there's always people always trying to show the false, but they don't have a very big impact. On the other hand, of the 190 or so division level engagements at the Battle of Kursk from 4 July to 18 July 1943, I do not recall any clear successful feints. I should have added that in there. It just doesn't appear. People do get surprised. There are people who are wandering on the battlefield that they suddenly surprise and they suddenly show up. So there's people running around and doing surprises. But deliberate feints and deliberate surprises, which seem to be quite common in wargaming, do not appear to show up much in battle. Now, it may be that they just disappear in the records and they're being done and you're not seeing them. But there's actually not much record of any of this, of any of this tactical deception having much effect on the battlefield. And then psychological operations, which is, of course, the interest of our customer. And the only thing I had was some material from the Battle of Kursk, so Operation Silver Streak. So the Germans had a large propaganda campaign. And it was the largest propaganda campaign of the war. And they started on 7 May when things were quiet at the front, and they continued until early July 1943. So this was just before the Battle of Kursk, in the quiet period before the Battle of Kursk. And they dropped hundreds of thousands of propaganda leaflets and, something like 84.5 million propaganda leaflets and et cetera. And, 100,000, a million leaflets in a day coming down, et cetera. So they papered the other side. The other side certainly had lots of paper to work with, probably had some value as toilet paper. The basic reason for the propaganda campaign was to advertise the new OKH Basic Rule Number 13, which had been issued in April. This new order laid out a policy of preferred treatment for Russian deserters, and this was a clear attempt to try to win the hearts and minds 2 years into what had been a very brutal war. So they were trying to say, hey, we've changed the way we're going to treat you. We're going to treat you well if you come over. And so they vigorously dropped papers, did loudspeaker campaigns. They did it for 2 months. And the only thing we got in comparison is that it did double the number of deserters from May to April. So we went from 121 deserters reported in May by 60 deserters report in March and 55 in April. So the Germans' biggest propaganda campaign of the war generated an additional 60 deserters in 1 month across the entire front. Well, for one German army. Sorry, I have to be careful on that. There's multiple German armies, so it probably had a bigger effect than that. So Zemke reports in the period of May and June, there was a total of 662 deserters that came in. Less of them being that direct result from Silver Streak. So you can see you're getting an effect from all this operation. You're getting an effect of potentially 300 additional deserters. Or 60 additional deserters across each army. So it's not an earth-shaking effect, but it is an effect. This was required you to drop, what was clearly several hundred million, more than 100 million, probably 200 million propaganda leaflets. But we also suspect there's a little fuzziness in the data because the desertion rate in May would naturally be higher than in April due to desertion rates tending to go up in anticipation of combat actions. So in April, everyone knew there was going to be no fighting. Come May, the Germans were supposed to start their Battle of Kursk early in the was supposed to start the Battle of Kursk early in the month of May, and so in early May, all during May, there was rumors that the battle was about to start. Needless to say, desertion rates always go up before a battle. That's pretty well known. Now, I did have one little bit of microdata, and I happen to have forgotten about this, but I am currently working on a book called The Battle of Tolstoy Woods, which tracks the 48th Panzer Corps' attack from 9 to 15 July during the Battle of Kursk. And as I was going through that, literally 2 days ago, I stumbled across this, which I'd written up at one point, and I thought this nicely addresses the issue of leaflets. So we had an interview with a guy by the name of Lieutenant Schorn, who was with the 15th Panzer Regiment, which is part of the 11th Panzer Division, and he said, quote, "I do remember a particular effort on the 10th or 11th of July. Leaflets were dropped from some of our planes behind enemy lines, urging the Russian soldiers to defect to us. There was substantial feedback to that measure. The least that can be said is that a great many Russians did turn themselves over to us. The poor chaps were half starved, and for starters, got something to eat from us." Now, he does say there was a great many Russians that did turn themselves over to this. This is personal narrative from a guy who was there. He was with the Panzer Regiment. So you tend to sort of want to take that. But I, of course, being a little distrustful of any narrative data, I went back and checked the records. And the 11th Panzer Division reported capturing 41 prisoners, including 10 deserters on the 10th and 57 on the 11th. So I don't know what a great many is defined as, but I don't think that data shows that it was a great many. I mean, they were getting every single day. These units were getting a dozen or 2 dozen or more than that of prisoners every single day where they were conducting operations. So that was sort of my last observation, and that was more of a discussion of the value of narrative versus the value of data. And I will skip this last one, and I think that ends us for now. So, any questions in the remaining 8 minutes? If you want to look a little further into this, I do have 2 chapters on it on my book, War by Numbers. I will also be making this presentation again at the 4th Historical Analysis Annual Conference that we host every year now in Tyson's Corner near DC. This one's on the 20th through the 23rd of October, 21st through 23rd of October, and I will be giving this presentation slightly cleaned up at that conference also. And then finally, of course, there's the report that we did back in 2004 for OSD net assessment, and that's available through our website. All right. Doesn't look like there's any more questions. So thank you all. And you got 5 minutes until I guess this is the last presentation of the day. So day is over. Talk to you all later.